Imagine waking up on an ordinary morning, turning on the television or checking your cell phone and being confronted with an impossible-to-ignore headline: nuclear conflict hits major cities. Millions of lives at risk. The world you know is no longer the same. Familiar landscapes were replaced by images of destruction, fear, and uncertainty. It sounds like a science fiction plot, but it's a scenario that experts say is dangerously close to becoming reality. In recent years, global tensions have escalated in worrying ways. Regional conflicts, great power rivalries, and the collapse of nuclear arms control treaties paint a bleak picture. We are living in a world where, despite all the lessons of the past, nuclear weapons remain a real and growing threat to the survival of humanity. In this video, we take a deep dive into the issue of nuclear escalation. What makes it such a serious threat, how it affects our lives, and most importantly, what we can do to prevent the unimaginable. We will explore the devastating humanitarian impacts, strategic effects that could reshape the planet, and current dangers that make this one of the most critical moments in recent history. Follow until the end, because raising awareness on this topic is the first step to preventing the world from reaching its limit. What is at stake is nothing less than the future of humanity. To understand the danger of nuclear escalation today, it is essential to go back in time and understand how we got here. The world entered the nuclear age in 1945, with the devastating explosions in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. These bombs, although primitive compared to today's weapons, changed the course of history, making it clear that human destructive power had reached an unprecedented level. During the Cold War, the arms race between the United States and the Soviet Union caused the world's nuclear arsenal to reach alarming numbers. In the mid-1980s, it was estimated that there were more than 70,000 nuclear warheads on the planet. This was enough to destroy the Earth several times over. The concept of mutual assured destruction dominated international politics. The idea that any nuclear attack would be met with devastating retaliation, creating an unstable balance based on fear. Despite arms control treaties such as the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, NPT, and the SALT agreements, nuclear weapons have never ceased to be a threat. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, it was believed that the danger had receded. However, geopolitical reality has changed. Countries such as India, Pakistan, and North Korea have joined the nuclear club, increasing the complexity of international relations. Today, we face new challenges. The collapse of treaties such as the INF, Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces, and the modernization of arsenals by powers such as Russia, China, and the United States signal a return to the tensions of the past. Meanwhile, the risk of miscalculations, cyber attacks, and the accidental use of nuclear weapons grows exponentially. The current scenario is a minefield. The balance of power is more fragile than ever, and global leaders face the monumental task of averting a disaster that could be irreversible. Now, it is crucial to understand not only the impacts of this threat, but also how it directly affects our future. A nuclear war would not only be a tragedy for the countries directly involved, but a humanitarian disaster unprecedented in the history of humanity. Its immediate and long-term consequences would reset the foundations of global civilization, leading to a widespread collapse that would affect all aspects of life. At the time of a nuclear explosion, the target cities would be turned into ruins. The initial explosion would produce temperatures so high that everything within reach would be instantly vaporized. Millions of people could die in a matter of seconds. The shock wave would destroy buildings, vehicles, and any structure within miles. For survivors, the risks would continue. Serious injuries, extensive burns, and fatal exposure to radiation. This last factor, known as radiation poisoning, would cause painful deaths within days or weeks. In addition to the deaths, the psychological impact would be devastating. The collective trauma of losing loved ones, the destruction of home, and the constant fear of new explosions would paralyze entire societies. Refugees would be forced to leave affected areas, creating a global humanitarian crisis. Even decades after the conflict, the marks of a nuclear war would remain. The release of dust and soot into the atmosphere would partially block sunlight, triggering what scientists call nuclear winter. This phenomenon would drastically reduce global temperatures and harm agricultural production, leading to mass starvation. Health systems and infrastructure, already collapsed by the initial destruction, would be unable to care for survivors. Epidemics would spread rapidly in overcrowded refugee camps, further worsening the crisis. Furthermore, the genetic effects of radiation could cause mutations and hereditary diseases in future generations. At the global level, the environment would be seriously damaged. Burning forests would release tons of carbon dioxide, accelerating climate change. The oceans, contaminated by radioactive waste, would lose part of their biodiversity, compromising entire food chains. These scenarios are not exaggerations. Scientific models have shown that even a limited nuclear conflict, such as between two smaller nations, could affect billions of people around the world. The humanitarian impacts of a nuclear war do not respect borders, and its consequences would be felt by all nations, regardless of their participation in the conflict. A nuclear war would not only devastate human lives and the environment, but it would also cause an unprecedented strategic and geopolitical realignment. In a post-nuclear conflict world, the balance of power would be irrevocably altered, with profound implications for global security. The initial strategic impact would be the complete destabilization of international relations. Great powers, even those not directly involved in the conflict, would see their economies and political systems collapse. International alliances, such as NATO or the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, could collapse due to the inability to respond effectively to the catastrophe. This would open space for an era of global instability, where new actors would emerge to fill the power vacuum. Nuclear proliferation would become almost inevitable. Nations that previously hesitated to pursue nuclear weaponry, relying instead on treaties or alliances for their security, could consider nuclear weapons indispensable. This cycle of distrust would fuel a new arms race, perpetuating the risk of new conflicts. In addition to political chaos, the global economy would face an unprecedented crisis. Financial markets would collapse, with the destruction of key urban centers and the disruption of crucial supply chains. Regions dependent on food or energy exports would face shortages, worsening the humanitarian crisis. The destruction of critical infrastructure, ports, airports, power and communications networks, would make economic reconstruction difficult. Even countries not directly involved in the conflict would suffer the consequences. Global trade would be severely compromised, leading to an exponential increase in poverty and inequality. In political terms, governments would face monumental challenges in maintaining domestic order. Separatist movements, extremist groups, and opportunistic leaders could exploit the chaos to consolidate power in vulnerable regions. Fragile nations could fragment, creating failed states and territories without governance, which would become hotbeds of violence and insecurity. Furthermore, global institutions, such as the UN, could lose their legitimacy and effectiveness in the face of a catastrophe of this magnitude. The weakening of international organizations would worsen the inability to coordinate effective global responses, leaving the world even more fragmented. These strategic and geopolitical consequences reinforce that a nuclear conflict would not only be the end of an era, but the beginning of a new chaotic and unpredictable world. The need to avoid this scenario is an absolute priority. Although the world survived the Cold War without a nuclear war, the risk of escalation has never been higher than it is today. The combination of rising geopolitical tensions, the modernization of nuclear arsenals, and the weakening of international treaties has created a scenario in which a single mistake can trigger catastrophic consequences. Competition between great powers such as the United States, China, and Russia has escalated at an alarming rate. Territorial disputes, such as in the South China Sea, and regional conflicts, such as in Ukraine, have placed these powers in increasingly adversarial positions. The increasing militarization of strategic areas increases the risk of accidental clashes that could quickly spiral out of control. Furthermore, regional powers such as India and Pakistan continue to have tense relations, especially around the disputed region of Kashmir. Both have nuclear arsenals and are involved in a cycle of provocation and retaliation that can easily escalate into something more serious. On the Korean Peninsula, North Korea continues to expand its nuclear capabilities in defiance of international pressure. Nuclear arms control treaties, which served as pillars of global security, are in shambles. The collapse of the INF Treaty in 2019, which restricted intermediate-range weapons, and uncertainty surrounding the future of New START, the last major nuclear arms control agreement between the US and Russia, have created a dangerous void. Without these agreements, monitoring and limiting the growth of nuclear arsenals becomes practically non-existent. Technological developments add an even more worrying layer to the nuclear threat. The development of hypersonic weapons, which are difficult to detect and almost impossible to intercept, could trigger preemptive strikes between nations believing they will not have time to react. Furthermore, automation in military systems, including the use of artificial intelligence to monitor threats, can lead to catastrophic errors. A false alert or automated system failure could be interpreted as an imminent attack, resulting in devastating retaliation. With growing distrust between nations and the lack of robust dialogue mechanisms, the world is walking a dangerously tightrope. It has never been more important to recognize these risks and work to mitigate them before it is too late. Despite the severity of the nuclear threat, there is still hope. History shows that diplomacy, public engagement, and scientific advances can play crucial roles in preventing a disaster. The path to avoiding the unimaginable requires coordinated action, political will, and everyone's participation. The key to defusing nuclear tensions lies in open dialogue and cooperation. During the Cold War, treaties such as SALT, Strategic Arms Limitation Agreements, and INF demonstrated that even the most adversarial powers can find common ground to reduce risks. The focus must now be on renewing and modernizing these treaties. An expanded New START and a multilateral agreement involving new nuclear powers could establish stricter limits and clear rules to avoid an arms race. Furthermore, the creation of nuclear weapon-free zones in strategic regions could be a step towards reducing arsenals. Such zones already exist in parts of Latin America, Africa, and Southeast Asia, and expanding them to areas such as the Middle East could help mitigate regional tensions. Movements such as ICAN, International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, winner of the Nobel Peace Prize in 2017, have demonstrated that public pressure is a powerful tool. Citizens can pressure governments to adopt more responsible policies by signing petitions, participating in demonstrations, and supporting organizations that promote disarmament. Awareness about the impacts of nuclear war needs to be increased, especially among young people, who will inherit the challenges of the future. Although technology represents a risk, it can also be an ally. Advanced monitoring systems, such as radiation detection sensors and surveillance satellites, can prevent accidental attacks. Artificial intelligence, when used responsibly, can improve communication between nations and predict risk scenarios before they become crises. These solutions are not easy, but they are necessary. Avoiding a devastating future requires immediate action and a global commitment to put humanity above national interests. The question that remains is, will we be able to act before it is too late? Throughout this video, we explore one of the greatest threats facing humanity: nuclear escalation. From the horrors of the initial explosions to the long-term humanitarian, geopolitical, and environmental impacts, it has become clear that the risks are real and the consequences unimaginable. However, we also saw that there are still ways to avoid this devastating future. The challenge is before us. History has shown us that diplomacy, cooperation, and awareness can make a difference. But time is a luxury we cannot afford. To avoid disaster, it is essential that global leaders and ordinary citizens take responsibility for acting now. The future of the world is in our hands. As humanity, we create weapons capable of destroying the planet. Now, it is up to us to find the wisdom to ensure these weapons are never used. The choice is ours, and the time to act is now.